Manin aedatea peleia dio Achilles, ulomenen hamoria caiois algiateke, palas diptimus psychas aidi proiapsen eron, autus di haloria taucikinesin, o nois sete pasi, dios tetelei tabule, ex hudeta prota diaste tenerisante, atra eideste anaxandron, cae dios Achilles.
So begins the epic story of one key subplot in the battle for Troy, namely the wrath of the Greek hero Achilles, a wrath that will play out in tragic ways before the hero can find a sort of redemption. This video lecture is meant to provide you with a synopsis of Homer's Iliad and also to explore some of the background questions regarding Homer's identity and also some of the key concepts that frame epic poems in this particular period of Greek history. So, the Iliad and the Odyssey, both poems are attributed to a poet named Homer, but there still are a lot of questions regarding whether or not such a poet actually existed, and if so, if he's responsible for creating both epics. Now, these are questions that will probably never be answered conclusively, but they certainly have provided a great deal of fodder for debate over the centuries. Now, in summary, there are three schools of thought that exist regarding the identity of Homer and the authorship of the epics. First, there are the Unitarians, and these are basically the supporters of the idea that there was a Homer and he composed both the Iliad and the Odyssey, so they gave him a lot of credit. Now, next are the Analysts, which are the opposing school of thought, and they point out that there is some unevenness in the texts of both epics, and perhaps that is because it was a series of poets who are responsible over a long period of time for ultimately creating these epics that have come down to us. And finally, the most recent school of thought, developed in the 1920s, by Milman Parry and his student Albert Lord. And they proposed a theory of oral formulaic composition, which basically says that the epics are the result of generations of oral composition and transmission that were finally written down at some point. Now, to support their theory, Parry and Lord in the late 1920s and early 1930s they studied the South Slavic bards that were located in and around what used to be known as Yugoslavia, in the Balkans. And these bards, they are oral poets, and they're called guzlars in the native vernacular. And they were wholly illiterate. They could not read or write. Yet they would entertain, mesmerize audiences by reciting hundreds of lines of poetry. And these bards used formulas, phrases, and epithets that ensure regularity of the poetic meter, and type scenes that are basically descriptions of feasting, arming, etc., that are repeated in different sections of the epic with only minor variations. And these type scenes, they act as building blocks, which allow the bard to organize his material in performance. And the bard is thus able to recreate his poem in a different version each time he performs it. And rather than memorizing word for word, he can provide his audience with a new version of an old story. Now, to briefly illustrate this point, let's take a quick look at a scene from Michael Wood's documentary, In Search of the Trojan War, in which he recreates the steps of Milman Parry. And here is a scene when they are enjoying the performance of one of these guzlars.
Like Homer, these men are professional bards. They sing and play at weddings, feasts, and funerals. They were brought up from childhood in the tuition of a master. This man, Sheriff Tashliova, was given away at 7 years because even then it was seen he had the bardic gift. He is now a master. His repertoire includes 100 tales from the Turkish medieval epic of Kurulu, many of them over an hour long. He's singing from Kurulu now. Here in Kars, the audience sat for 3 hours, as long as we might sit in a cinema, thrilled by the playing and by the pathos of the singing. Here it is still possible to feel the spell worked by a bard when he has an audience who believe in his magic. However distantly, Homer did something like this 2,500 years ago when he sang the tale of Troy.
So the ability of the Guslars to take an epic story of a legendary hero or battle and revise it ever so slightly to make it their own version and then recite that version for an audience convinced Milman Parry and Lord that if these recited poems, which had never been written down, are being kept alive solely by oral composition in the 20th century, it certainly could have been done in the Greek Dark Age and into the Archaic period before the Greeks had adapted the Phoenician alphabet. So that's just some background. Now, a very brief synopsis of the Iliad itself. The Iliad, that is, a poem about Ilium, Ilium being the name that the Greeks gave to Troy. So the Iliad is about Ilium, consists of books, and these books are the equivalent nowadays of our book chapters. So each book would be a chapter, and we're looking at 24 of these chapters. And what we're looking at is a period of about 54 days. Scholars believe that the Iliad covers about 54 days in the last year of the 10-year battle for Troy. Now, on its basic level, the Iliad subject is the wrath of the hero Achilles. And Achilles is angered at the very beginning of the Iliad in Book 1. He's angered because his honor has been affronted by King Agamemnon, who is nominally in charge of the Greek expedition to punish the Trojans for absconding with Helen, the queen of Sparta and wife of Menelaus, Agamemnon's younger brother. So Agamemnon has taken away a battle prize that Achilles has earned. And back during the heroic age, we are meant to understand that heroes would be allotted their share of the loot depending on how well they fought. And, of course, Achilles is always getting the best of prizes, what the Greeks referred to as a geros. And in this case, the main prize taken by the Greeks during a raid on a Trojan ally was a young maiden captive named Briseis. Now, King Agamemnon was awarded another maiden named Chryseis, but her father, who was a priest of Apollo, asks kindly to ransom back his daughter. Agamemnon sends him rudely away, and of course the father is going to pray to Apollo to punish the Greeks, which Apollo does by sending a plague upon them. After a few days of misery and disease, Agamemnon is finally forced to give up Chryseis and send her back to her father so the plague will be lifted. But Agamemnon will demand some other prize to replace her. I mean, after all, he is the king, so he cannot go without a prize. And Achilles objects to this and says, there's nothing in the rules that says you get a consolation prize. But ultimately, it's Agamemnon who decides that he will take Briseis, the maiden who was awarded to Achilles. Now, Achilles is enraged and decides that he will no longer participate in the battle for Troy. But he will not leave the shores of Troy, and instead he will more or less sulk in his tent while the rest of the Greeks continue the battle fighting and dying outside the massive walls of Troy. So to us, the behavior of Agamemnon and Achilles, fighting over prizes, seems rather petulant and childish. But to properly contextualize Achilles' anger, we have to understand the interrelated concepts of time and kleos, which drove the behaviors of these heroes in these epics. So, time first. Time is honor, and as you can see from the definition here, time refers to the tangible gifts, the loot, and some things that are awarded to a hero because he fights so well. The young maiden Briseis is a war prize, and when Achilles is forced to give her up, not only does he lose time, the actual prize, but more importantly for him and for all these other heroes, he loses kleos. And here you can see kleos translated as glory, which relates to what other people say about you. And your kleos as a hero depends on the amount of time, the amount of loot that you are able to accumulate because of your skills on the battlefield and the recognitions that your peers have bestowed upon you with either slaves or material goods. So when Agamemnon takes away Briseis from Achilles, he has not only affronted Achilles' honor, but also his glory, his kleos. And what's important about kleos is that it not only refers to what people say about you here in the living world, but kleos also serves as a form of immortality, because long after you are dead, people will talk about you. They will literally sing your praises if you are worthy. And so for human beings, for us mortals, kleos is about as close as we can get to immortality. To have some bards continuously sing songs telling future generations how awesome we were. So for Achilles, all this is put in jeopardy when Agamemnon very publicly strips away his war prize. So you can only really understand the wrath and the anger of Achilles if you understand these concepts, how big a breach of heroic etiquette this was, and why Achilles would choose not to fight anymore and sit on the sidelines while his friends and comrades are killed outside the walls of Troy. Because these Trojans are putting up a pretty good defense, as they have been for the previous 9 years, most of it due to Prince Hektor, who is the Prince of Troy, most responsible for the defense of the city. He is King Priam's eldest son, and is by far the most formidable champion that the Trojans have. And of course, there is a in-depth study that Homer allows us into the life of Hektor, Prince of Troy, and what drives him to fight this war. And of course, it is mainly to defend his homeland and his family. He has a loving and supportive wife, Andromache, and a young baby that has just been born, young Prince Astyanax. And, of course, he wants to protect them and all the other citizens of Troy. And Homer does allow a very sympathetic portrayal of this Trojan character, much to his credit, because, of course, this could have been just a work of Greek propaganda, but it is much more balanced. The Iliad is much more nuanced than that. So it's a big crisis now because the Greeks will be taking heavier casualties because Achilles is absent from the battlefield. And Agamemnon, who was technically in charge, suddenly has to scramble to try to get Achilles back in the battle. And there is this pivotal scene where Agamemnon decides to send 3 characters to plead with Achilles to re-enter the battle. This is known as the embassy to Achilles. And each of these characters, Odysseus, who you may be familiar with from the Odyssey, the other epic that is attributed to Homer, he is a formidable warrior and a very clever personality. And accompanying Odysseus is Phoenix, who was Achilles' tutor when Achilles was a young boy. So they're hoping for some paternal influence on the recalcitrant warrior. And another warrior named Ajax the Greater, as opposed to Ajax the Lesser, who is a lesser figure. But Ajax the Greater is by far the greatest fighting figure that the Greeks have other than Achilles. So these three guys show up in Achilles' tent and basically plead with him to rejoin the battle, saying that Agamemnon admits that he was wrong, and Agamemnon is willing to give Achilles many prizes if Achilles will rejoin the battle. Achilles refuses, and this is a stunning rebuke to Agamemnon, and also a stunning rebuke to the whole value system that supposedly drove heroes to do what they do best, and that is to fight on the battlefield in order to gain time and kleos. So Achilles just flat out refuses all the prizes that Agamemnon has promised him, but he does conditionally say that when the Trojans have reached our ships and are beginning to burn our ships here on the beach, then I will rejoin the battle. Until that moment, no, I'm just going to sit here and watch you guys fight and die. So, needless to say, everybody is disappointed by this outcome. Now, the key moment arrives when the Trojans are indeed pressing the attack, and many of the Greek heroes have been wounded, and things look very grim for the Greeks. And it's at that moment where Achilles, his best friend, a young man named Patroklos, begs Achilles to rejoin the battle, and Achilles says no. And Patroklos then says, well, can I use your armor? Because with your armor, perhaps the Trojans will think that you have rejoined the battle, and because they're so fearful of you, they will back off, and that will buy us some time. So Achilles relents and decides, okay, you can use my armor. But unfortunately, Patroklos is killed in battle by the Trojan prince Hektor. This now will bring back Achilles into the battle because Achilles goes into this epic rage and cannot rest until he has avenged the death of Patroklos. So he seeks Hektor out on the battlefield, and Hektor and Achilles meet each other in single combat, and Achilles makes it clear to Hektor that after he kills Hektor, he will disrespect and defile his body. And this, of course, is a major taboo for these warriors because they expected that when they died, their body would be treated with all due respect, and Achilles basically says, no, that's not going to happen. So Achilles will kill Hektor and will defile his body by basically roping his legs to the back of a chariot, and Achilles will circle the city of Troy so that all the Trojans can see what has happened to their champion, the beloved Prince Hektor. And so Achilles, in the grip of this epic rage spiral, cannot find peace or consolation. And it gets so bad that even the gods on Mount Olympus are disgusted by Achilles and his behavior, because he refuses flat out to provide Hektor's body with the ritual that it would need to enter the underworld. And so ultimately, the conclusion of the Iliad has Zeus sending Hermes, the messenger god, to King Priam, who is both the king of Troy, and as I mentioned earlier, he also is Hektor's grieving father. So Hermes will guide Priam into the Greek camp and into Achilles' tent. And here we see this type of reconciliation in which these two opponents, who technically should hate one another, find solace in the grief they share. Priam for Hektor, and Achilles not only for his friend Patroklos, but in a poignant moment, the aged Priam also reminds Achilles of his own father, Peleus. By realizing the suffering he has caused Priam, Achilles has a profound cathartic moment in which he regains his lost humanity. And at the end of the Iliad, Achilles will allow Hektor's body to be returned to Priam, and Priam will take it back to the city where it will be given the proper funeral rituals. So, at the very end of the Iliad, the rage-maddened Achilles will finally find his humanity through this act of kindness by returning a fallen son to his grieving father,